History is often an overlooked aspect in the concept we call life. We witness it every day, we experience it every day, and we make it every day. But often, we don't give it more than a passing thought. For example, take a look at where I am standing. To the average bystander, it's just an ordinary junkyard. And, for many, it is. But there is history hidden beneath the endless piles of scrap. A very important history to this town that I called home for many years. Siloam Springs. It's right beneath my feet, though the shadows cast by the late afternoon sun might have made that obvious. This was once a railroad line, a spur that branched off the main line into a Y. It connected to a factory, an ice plant to be precise. Once vital to the economy of Siloam Springs, all that remains are rails that haven't been torn up, buried under earth and asphalt, long forgotten by the general public. But not forgotten by those who remember. And that's the purpose of this mural, to remember what used to be preserved in paint. Even so, those who drive by or even walk on South Hyco Street don't even glance at the mural. Or maybe they do, but barely give it a petty thought. And I can likely count on a single hand how many people have noticed this old piece of rail sticking out of the dirt like a sore thumb. How about the old town map hanging in City Hall, which shows, very clearly, the railroad lines of not just present day, but of days and industries gone by. Even looking at satellite imagery of the area, unless you have a keen eye, you would never have known that rails once ran down the middle of the street. While this tidbit of Siloam Springs' history is relatively unknown, consider this. How many knew there used to be a depot here, or the train that once stopped there? Many here are unaware of just how important the role of the railroad was.
Trains have always played a vital part in the growth of Siloam Springs, Arkansas. Siloam Springs
What if I told you that just 12 miles south, in a small Oklahoma town called Westville, there was another railroad that crossed over the former Kansas City Southern main line? Can you spot it? We're looking right at it. Give up? Of course you can't find it. It no longer exists. As this railroad crossed over the state line, it snaked east through the Ozark Mountains, around the battlefields of the Civil War, into Washington County, where it reached its easternmost terminus, or more rather its starting point, on a line all too familiar for me. Today, there's few artifacts that remain, and even fewer who know of its existence. I think I've made my point. As much as I'd love to go on about the history of the Ozark and Cherokee Central Railway, and all of its forgotten history, that's for another day. So why am I telling you this? Why did I give you all of that preface over the last nearly 4.5 minutes? Well, it all started on April 14th, 2023, a day I will always remember. It was the day that the Kansas City Southern faded into history. I was out and about trackside that day, catching the final true KCS trains before the merger took place at 10 in the morning Central Standard Time. The Kansas City Southern as a railroad has always been fascinating to me, and not just because I grew up with it.
The history of Kansas City Southern is something that is often overlooked. The road itself was quite small, the smallest class 1 in North America. But that doesn't mean it wasn't interesting, nor does that mean that anything interesting ever runs on these rails.
That is, of course, not to imply that it didn't have its fans, but it wasn't as popular as the other, often much bigger railroads that had dominated the country. I can still recount with full clarity the endless seas of battleship gray whizzing past. But then, a thought occurred to me. Those are but personal memories, and personal memories hardly equate to tangible history. The sites I had known were long gone, and today would soon be tomorrow. And then I would blink, and 10 years would have gone in an instant. Then, an even more concerning thought popped into my mind. This area, comparatively, does not have a lot of photography around it, and documentation is already scarce. To find anyone who has done so is quite rare, and I began to worry that this might be history that would soon become lost forever. Unless someone did something about it. So I had decided, from that day forth, to document as much of the changing times as I possibly could, and for the next year, I did. I spent every moment I could capturing every train I encountered, and as a bonus, I got to learn the history behind these rails in the process. While researching for this project, there was one spot in particular that I always felt a connection to. That was this bridge near Watts, Oklahoma. See, while researching, I stumbled upon this photograph taken by notable photographer Mike Condren. Going through my archives, I discovered I had unintentionally almost recreated the shot one for one. Granted, barring the historical changes over the last 5 decades, this is a location I had a lot of personal and sentimental history with, as this was where my grandpa lived, just up the hill behind the camera, and we used to spend a lot of time watching the trains go by. So, I made a plan. The original photograph was snapped in August of 1975, and 2025 was not far away. I decided I would come back to this bridge and recreate the photograph 50 years later to the month. And that's exactly what I did. I had planned to do this all month, but ended up becoming extremely busy and taking a trip to the hospital for a week. Don't worry, I'm alright. But on the final day of August, I was finally able to put my plan into action. It is currently 10 before 7 in the morning, and the sun hasn't even begun to crust the plateaus of the Ozark Highlands. By this time, the roosters have already begun to crow. The low lighting makes for a peaceful scene, and the rushing waters of Ballard Creek made for a tranquil sound. At least before another car passes by. We are in the exact spot, or close to the exact spot, where the photograph was taken 50 years ago in the community of Ballard, just adjacent south of Watts. This is milepost 237.3 on the Kansas City Southern, and technically known as Ballard Creek Bridge No. 2, with No. 1 just down the road. As this day progresses, we'll go over relevant history when it comes up, but let us first begin with a brief history of the origins of Kansas City Southern. Initially founded as the Kansas City Suburban Belt Railroad in 1890, the president and brainchild responsible for the years to come was Arthur Stillwell. Working as a New England insurance agent, his grandfather, Hamlin Stillwell, was one of the founding members of the New York Central Railroad and a close friend of Commodore Vanderbilt. When Arthur moved out west to Kansas City, it did not take long for the railroad bug to bite him. This belt railway connected Argentine, Kansas to Independence, Missouri, and was highly successful. It soon expanded southwards to Joplin, Missouri, and was renamed the Kansas City, Nevada, and Fort Smith Railroad, adding such commodities as coal, zinc, and lead. With backing from Dutch railway investor Jan de Hoyen, they secured and acquired both the Texarkana and Fort Smith Railway and the Kansas City, Fort Smith, and Southern in 1893. The railroad was once again renamed, this time to the Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Gulf. To reach its southernmost namesake, the KCP&G nearly bought the Houston, East and West Texas Railroad to reach the ports in Galveston, Texas, but Arthur was uneasy about the lack of protection against bad weather and declined the sale. Instead, they constructed a new port in 1895 along the Gulf of Mexico, and 2 years later, Port Arthur was officially active with shipments. And a good thing, too, as Galveston would be totally destroyed by hurricane in the Great Storm and Flood of 1900. Now that business was booming, the KCP&G needed a whole fleet of freight cars for it, but as a result of the construction of Port Arthur, it left the railroad completely out of cash. Arthur went to his friend George Pullman of the Pullman Car Company, and they struck a handshake deal of $3 million to build 1,000 boxcars. But as the deal was being finalized, George suddenly passed away, leaving the KCP&G in debt, and soon it filed for bankruptcy, also in 1900. Arthur Stilwell was voted out by his board, and he would live until 1928. Colonel Samuel Fordyce was brought in as leader, and the KCP&G officially reorganized that year into the Kansas City Southern. At 7:31 in the morning, the signal glows green, giving us our first train, a southbound CPKC mixed freight with 2 Canadian Pacific AC 4400s on the lead.
Here goes nothing.
Southbound trains are what I am looking for, so I will be using my phone to record the trains and my camera to photograph them. The inverse will be mostly true for northbound trains. The photograph will be shown after the last car rolls past the lens. This Canadian Pacific Hawker Siddeley built 65-foot gondola, still in the multi-mark scheme, brings up a good opportunity to mention that any interesting freight cars captured will be shown off anecdotally. Those classic bright yellow railbox boxcars are unfortunately a dying breed. Many have been sent for scrap, and many more are still being retired. This train resulted in an alright photograph, neat motion blur, and definitely a good showcase of locomotive power post-merger. But it doesn't recapture what I am looking for. With that said, however, the EOT flashes into the distance, disappearing behind the trees. The amber light of the caution signal fades into darkness as the train enters the blocks for Westville, Barron, Stilwell, and beyond. It's 8:20 in the morning now, and I decide to move to a different location to gather B-roll footage. Here, we are on the north bank of the Illinois River, overlooking, or more rather underlooking, the 1900-built girder and through truss bridge at milepost 234. While many campers might be more interested in the largemouth bass that inhabits this portion of the Illinois River, our interest lays in the history of this bridge. Constructed in 1900 as stated, it was manufactured by the American Bridge Company, originally the Lassig Bridge and Iron Company of Chicago, Illinois. Of particular note, the piers still have the molding flash where all of the wooden planks used for the mold were assembled. One historical side note I would like to mention, this bridge has weathered a lot in the 125 years it has stood, including the flood of 2017. The bridge stood strong against the rising and strong battering currents. The right-of-way, not so much. The sound of an approaching southbound coal train with Union Pacific ES-44AC number 7844 on the point echoes over the waters of the Illinois River and drags its load over the bridge. A side note, that is not a smudge on my camera to the right. That's smoke from a trailer home temporarily set up on the riverbank. The crawling coal train slows to an even more sluggish pace as it takes the siding for an oncoming northbound mixed freight. With the northbound fast approaching, I returned to my original position and set my tripod back up, ready to film. But not before taking the opportunity to snag a shot of this crane that had been circling the area. Soon enough, the freight train with AC 4400 CW number 4743 leading rounds the corner and glides by. The freight train disappears behind the trees, and the signal soon goes green, giving the all clear for the coal train, bound for Heaton. This particular photograph does showcase the foreign power often seen, but it's still not what I'm looking for. My goal is to capture the true spirit of the KCS, and showcase in good artistic photographic detail the changing times and nature of railroading in the last half-century. As the coal drag picks up speed, I decide to head back north into town to check on the freight train. The train is split, with one half on the main line and the other half in the hole. I have no inkling to why this was, perhaps picking up a cut of cars from bakery feeds. Regardless, it gave me the perfect opportunity to get a better look of some of the freight cars in the consist, such as this Canadian Pacific boxcar built for pulp and paper service, still in the CP Rail brand. It's not quite the multi-mark, but beggars can't be choosers after all. Or, how about this Canadian-American Railroad 50-foot high-cube boxcar? Many rail fans talk about the fallen flags of Class I railroads, but underappreciated are the numerous and expansive short lines lost to time. With bakery feeds in full view highlighting the background, it provides an excellent opportunity to discuss the history of this town through the visuals of archive material. While the area had previously been established as a military fort named Camp Illinois, after the river, in the early 1800s, then later Fort Wayne, Watts was purely a railroad town. Constructed in 1912 by the Kansas City Southern on the existing 1895 line built by the predecessor KCP&G, the new town got its name from John Watts, a chief of the Chickamauga faction of the Cherokee Native American tribe. Becoming milepost 236, everything from a station, a coal chute, water tower, and other amenities were built, and Kansas City Southern moved their division point from Stillwell to the south to this new town. The roundhouse saw all sorts of steam engines, including the large, powerful, and ever-awesome 210-4 Texas locomotives, the 900 series J-Class. Many of the engines that stayed in the roundhouse were used as helper locomotives for northbound trains going into Siloam Springs, as the journey north encountered a 1.36% grade. The nearby community of Ballard practically moved the mile north to this town, including a lumberyard and hardware store, and many folks from land surveyors to gamblers came to live here, but none as prominent as the railroad workers. While this burst of prosperity brought life to the town, it never reached a population of over 400, and by the 1920s it had already begun to decline. In 1953, the Kansas City Southern ended steam operations, opting very early on for dieselization, which started with the delivery of EMC NW2 number 1100 in May of 1939. As a result, the roundhouse, coal chute, water tower, and other related structures were demolished around the same time, if not a year or two earlier. Watts remained the division point on the KCS between Pittsburgh, Kansas, and Heavener, Oklahoma, and the depot was used as a crew change point after passenger services ended in 1969. The division point was once again moved in 1989, however, this time to Heavener, Oklahoma, where it remains today. The now abandoned depot, which had been refurbished the year prior, was demolished several months later. At this point, only the feed business remained in Watts, and a passing siding for the passing freight trains and locals were the most excitement the town got.
You get that one on there? Yeah.
Barring a mini sorting yard built in 2008, it has remained that way ever since. Thankfully, the town hasn't completely forgotten its railroad history, and the city of Watts uses the steam locomotive as the logo for its police force and schools. With all of the history out of the way, it's now 11:37 in the morning, and CPKC rack train number 263 is northbound and down with pure KCS power. AC 4400 CW number 4606 is on the point. just happened. The train was thrown into emergency after the defect detector at milepost 238 was tripped. Turns out, the cut lever on this BNSF autorack had come loose and dislodged.
Yeah, you don't quite want that to happen.
The train would sit here for about half an hour before the conductor walked over to fix it. After bending the lever back into place, he performed the mandatory roll-by inspection. That was not the only rack to capture my attention. This ancient gem was a surprise addition of today's consist. After giving the conductor a ride back up to the head of the train, it appears a grain train had taken the siding during the delay, and acting as the helper was this special surprise. The old and just as old, but with a fresh coat of paint, meet on separate ground levels. While not exactly my goal, the symbolism made this a worthwhile shot. With the autorack train clear of the main and out of the way, the southbound grain train departs, and I return to my original position again. Your KCS power is becoming rarer and rarer by the day, and it really makes this photo pop. I also snagged this shot of AC 4400 CW number 8128, and as it turns out, this is not the 8128's first trip through Watts. At the present, the CPKC corporate scheme is not common at all. I'm sure in time, the reverse AWVR will become an everyday sight. Under normal circumstances, I would be content with the photo I had gotten, but I had received word that 2 special locomotives on 2 separate trains, one northbound and one southbound, were heading my way. So, I stayed behind a little bit longer, and at 2:07 in the afternoon, the northbound arrived, with Kansas City Southern, Gray Ghost, number 4564. It's always nice to see the Gray Ghosts soldier on. Having grown up with Gray, it's a nostalgic sight for me, and a site with an interesting history. This particular KCSM AC-44 was built for KCS subsidiary TFM, or Transportación Ferroviaria Mexicana, in August of 2000, and was delivered in lettering for such. When TFM became fully integrated into KCS, it was relettered for Kansas City Southern de Mexico and has slipped through the cracks of the paint shops, and still roams the rails in Battleship Gray. Interesting to think that this month marked its 25th birthday on top of my 50-year goal. As an extra aside, TFM obtained a big handful of Ferrocarriles Nacionales de Mexico, or NDM locomotives and rolling stock, after it was privatized. And for a short time after, it was not uncommon to find a two-tone blue locomotive in the area.
All right. Moment of truth.
At 2:32 in the afternoon, the moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived. After waiting in the hole for the grain train, it began to crawl forward to reveal Canadian Pacific EMD SD70 ACU number 7017. Trailing behind, Kansas City Southern General Electric ES44 AC number 4772. And that is my photo. A heritage unit on the lead and my home road trailing behind. It's symbolic and a perfect encapsulation of this railroad from then to now, rich in history and overshadowed. After disappearing behind the trees, it began to rain, so I packed up and headed home, satisfied. While I give my closing statements, please enjoy this small compilation of archive footage I've shot over the years. This project taught me a lot about both this area and the Kansas City Southern, and how they've evolved over time. It really puts into perspective how influential the railroads have been, and how we forget their role. Even if this project I undertook will become as obscure as the KCS itself, at the very least, I got to partake in preserving history while making it in the process. Though I won't miss the 37 hours without sleep.